Good morning. My name is Mary Sakilariadou and I'm the president of the European Physical Society. I'm going to highlight the report about the importance of physics to the economies of Europe. Let me first tell you a few things about the European Physical Society. We're a federation of European physicists. Our members are all national physical societies in Europe. We have associate members like research institutions, universities, and the industry, and a number of individual members. Our headquarters are in Mulhouse, in France. The European Physical Society advances and promotes physics across Europe and beyond, and our main mission is to foster an inclusive and collaborative community of physicists in order to be able to tackle the global challenges facing our society. We support physicists in research, in education, public engagement, and we amplify the role of physics in driving progress in fundamental physics, but not only, in technological advancement, sustainable energy, as well as environmental protection. In order to achieve our goal, we're committed to equitable access to knowledge, funding, infrastructure, and career opportunities. As a matter of fact, we support a lot the career developments of the young physicists who are going to secure future challenges in our society. The APS structure. We have 12 divisions representing the different fields of physics, namely atomic, molecular, and optical physics, condensed matter, physics education, environmental physics, gravitational physics, high energy and particle physics, nuclear physics, physics in life sciences, plasma physics, quantum electronics and optics, European solar physics, and statistical and nonlinear physics. In addition, we have 6 groups addressing interdisciplinary topics. Those are accelerators, computational physics, energy, history of physics, physics for development, and technology and innovation. We're going to discuss about physics and physics-based sectors. So let me define those two. Physics is the natural science that studies matter, energy, and their interactions. And our goal is to understand the fundamental laws governing our universe. Now, in order to achieve that, we combine observational and experimental data with mathematical descriptions. Physics-based sectors are defined as the sectors where the use of physics in terms of technologies or expertise is integral and critical to their activity. The Center for Economics and Business Research report has been commissioned for first time by the European Physical Society in 2022. This is the 3rd edition that we launched today. Our aim is through this report to demonstrate quantitatively the impact of physics. All 3 reports show the continued importance of physics to the European economies. We launched this report today in Brussels because this report includes the 27 individual countries of the European Union, but in addition, it includes the United Kingdom and the non-EU European Free Trade Association countries, namely Iceland, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. After all, physics is an international endeavor. So let me start with the European physics-based business population. In this plot, you can see the composition of physics-based sectors across different industries and number of enterprises in 2022. And you can clearly see that this dark blue of 52.7% represents professional, scientific, and technological activities. Is the highest contribution. Now, the countries with the highest proportion of total physics-based enterprises are Italy, 16.2%, Germany, 11%, and France, 10.3%. Direct impact of physics-based sector in Europe. So here we saw in darker blue the 27 EU countries. In light blue is the non-EU contribution from these countries, and in this gray curved we saw the physics-based sector percentage of physics, of business economy. Now, the plot shows the turnover in physics-based sectors and the proportion of business economy turnover and the percentage between the years 2016 and 2022. Clearly, you can see that the strongest growth are in 2021 and 2022, and the weakest growth is in 2020, which, as a matter of fact, is the effect of the COVID-19. With France and United Kingdom representing the next two major contributors, each of them 14.2 and 13.9 respectively. However, in relative terms, Germany is no longer leader in Europe in physics-based turnover. We should keep in mind that Norway, far higher than any other country, in 2022 contributed 37.9%, Hungary 26.4%, and Slovenia 22.1%. They have the highest shares throughout the whole period. The direct impact of physics-based sector in Europe, gross value added. In the plot on the left, we saw the value added in physics-based sector and the proportion of the whole economy value added. Again, in dark blue is the 27 European Union countries. The light blue is the non-EU contribution, and then we have the percentage of the business economy in this gray curve. Okay? In the right-hand side, we saw the indexed gross value added trends in the physics-based sector, and we have normalized it to a value 100 for the 2016. Clearly here, you can see the professional, scientific, and technical activities, retail, constructions, manufacturing. Clearly from here, we can see that physics-based activities saw a strong growth of 44.1% between 2016 and 2022, and they were only surpassed by construction sector, which grew by almost 50%. Direct impact of physics-based sector in Europe, the total employment. Again, the dark blue shows the 27 European countries, EU countries, the light blue, the non-EU one, and the percentage of business economy, it is the gray curve. Now, the physics-based sector, from what you can see here, is a substantial employer of high-skilled workers throughout the whole European economy. The physics-based industries account for total headcount employment of around 20.1 million people in Europe in 2022. And this means that the increase we have from 2016 was about 1.8 million, which represents a physics-based employment growth of 10% over the 6-year period, okay? Between 2016 and 2022. Germany was the largest contributor to European physics-based employment, constituted a quarter of the total. Likely, it is the result of Germany's role as a manufacturing hub in Europe. However, it's important to keep in mind that Switzerland leads Europe in terms of share of business economy employment stemming from the physics-based sector. In other words, more than 1 in 6 Swiss workers employed around physics-related activity in 2022. Direct impact of physics-based sector in Europe, total employment. Again, now here we show the share of physics-based employment by broad sector in 2022. And you can see that in the right-hand side, the 47.4% corresponds to manufacturing. Then we have the dark blue of 23.9%, which is the professional, scientific, and technological activities, that's the second contribution. And the third one is the light gray of 9%, which corresponds to construction. In this plot, we saw the physics-based employment by broad sector, and again, we have normalized the year 2016 to a value of 100.
And the various curves, they show the different sectors, physics-based sectors, transport, oil activities, construction, and so on. What is interesting to see here is the energy production employment grew 19% over the period of the 6 years, while construction employment grew just by 20%. Oil and gas activities experienced a 24% decline in physics-based employment, and the treatment of hazardous materials experienced a 10% decline over this period. So the important conclusion out of that is this shifting dynamic of employment within physics-based sectors away from oil and gas towards energy production and construction. And this, as a matter of fact, reflects economic and environmental trends throughout Europe. This is particularly important because it shows that there is an adaptability of physics-based deployment to both long-term policy goals and unpredictable geopolitical shocks. This adaptability highlights the importance of the sector in supporting economic stability and energy security in Europe. And I would like to emphasize that because I believe it's extremely important nowadays. Now, in this plot, we show the productivity, as you can see, for different kinds of sectors, manufacturing, construction, retail, and so on. 20.1 million jobs are directly supported by physics-based industries across Europe. The countries that saw the highest productivity were Ireland, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Belgium. The average physics-based sector worker added more than double the value of the average construction sector worker and nearly double the average retail sector worker in 2022. The aggregate impact of the physics-based sector in Europe. Now, this plot shows the physics-based and other selected sector shares of the EU 27 countries, the whole economy output at 2022. So you can see the physics-based sector is just the left one, the gray, the dark gray, and you can see that the output is more than 2.2 times greater than the generated in both the construction, which is the fourth column you see, and the professional, scientific, and technical sectors, which is the last column on the right. For every direct physics-based job, the physics-based sector supported a further 1.78 jobs throughout the 27 EU countries' economy through its indirect and induced activity. On aggregate, the physics-based sector supports over 47.2 million jobs throughout the 27 EU countries' economies. The total direct employee compensation in the physics-based sector accounted for 17.2% of the total 27 EU countries' employee compensation. Research and development expenditure. Here again, this plot shows for the 27 EU countries the physics-based expenditure on scientific research and development between the 2016 and 2022 years. The scientific research and development in the physics-based sector grew by 36.5% from 2016 to 2022, reaching 24.88 billion. This growth was primarily driven by the manufacturing and professional activity sector, which accounted for an average of 99% of the total physics-based R&D over the period. Note that this is external R&D spending and does not include money spent internally to companies on R&D or state-funded R&D expenditure. So the message out of all that is that investing in physics is indeed investing in Europe's prosperity, security, and sustainability. Thank you.
So I'm Owen. I was one of the authors responsible for the report. I'm the head of economic advisory at the Centre for Economics and Business Research. And as was alluded to, this is the third iteration of this report that we have worked on. My responsibility for this part of the presentation is talking about the underlying modelling work and the definition that led to all of those headline findings that were just explained a moment ago. So, in terms of the actual definition of the physics-based sector, the definition that was undertaken is one, as was set out, that is a relatively broad definition. So it's not exclusively looking at perhaps people who work as professional physicists, but it's all individuals or all businesses, sectors of the economy which are fundamentally underpinned by physics-related skills and knowledge. And that leads to, as will be seen on the next slide, quite a broad definition of economic activity that is included. And based upon that conceptual definition, the task that we had was mapping that to the wider statistics and the wider frameworks for the reporting of economic data. And in particular, something called the NACE or NAIC sectoral framework, which is the framework for the reporting of economic data across much of Europe, and indeed as is used by Eurostat, which was one of the main data sources for our economic impact analysis. And this framework breaks up the economy into a discrete, exhaustive set of sectors. And this initially starts at a relatively aggregated level. So manufacturing, for example, one of the sectors that was talked through a moment ago, that will be a one-digit NAIC code, is how we refer to that. And then beyond that, you can go to more granular levels. So you can go down to 2 digits, which might be perhaps manufacturing of food and drink. And then 3, 4 digits in turn, getting more and more detailed. So those would perhaps be the manufacturing of beer or of dairy products. And the way that we undertook this process was we looked at all of the predominantly 4-digit NAIC codes, which is the most granular level that the data allows you to go down to. And we tested that definition of physics against each of those codes individually. Is it an industry that is fundamentally underpinned by physics and physics-related knowledge? And that test was carried out across hundreds of different sectors in collaboration with the European Physical Society and similarly in the UK for specific research we've done there with the Institute of Physics. And that leads to an agreed definition for physics that spans about 70 different sector codes, which I'll run through in a moment, that can be mapped against the wider frameworks for economic data that allows us to then begin aggregating the figures to provide the findings that were talked through a moment ago. We refer to this as a bottom-up approach because we are utilising data at the most granular possible level and aggregating this to estimate the overall headline findings. An alternative approach you could possibly take would be to start with high-level data, so for example, the overall number of employment in Europe or the overall contribution of European GDP, and then trying to estimate the share within that is attributable to physics based on various secondary techniques. Ultimately, that approach was considered not to be as robust for the purposes of this study, and hence that bottom-up approach that I just spoke through. It's probably also worth noting that this definition that we utilised is the same as the definition undertaken for the 2 prior versions of this report, and therefore we have consistency over the total period that's been analysed. I will not read through all of these, but this provides the 72 sectors that ultimately met that definition of being fundamentally underpinned by physics or physics-related knowledge, and this was then what was aggregated into those more headline categories. So, for example, manufacturing or professional, scientific, and technical activities. That was the level of detail provided in the prior component of this presentation. You can see this is a very broad range of sectors, I think demonstrating the breadth of value that physics provides across different components of the European economy. Everything from photographic activities, SIC code 74.2, radio broadcasting 60.1, to various energy generation and electricity transmission related activities. That's some of the codes that start 06, 09, or 35. I think a couple of things to kind of call out in this. You can see the breadth of manufacturing-related activity that is included. About half of the total codes that are included here, including most of the first two columns, those that are starting at about 20 and going through to the mid-30s would be manufacturing-related activity. And then you have some of the perhaps more sort of traditional classical physics-related activity around technical testing, research and development, laboratory work. You can see that on the far left-hand side with some of the codes that begin with a 7. Once that definition was established and set, we then had the task of actually aggregating the data and estimating the wider impacts from that. So as I mentioned, one of the key data sources underpinning this was a Eurostat database, the Structural Business Statistics, or the SBS. And this was really valuable because it provided business but also wider economic data at that very granular NAIC code level across all of the EU member states and indeed some of the other countries, including the analysis such as the EFTA nations. And this covered everything from business demography, so business numbers, business size, birth rate, death rate, etc., total business turnover, through to some of the more sort of traditional economic statistics such as your gross value added or contribution to GDP or employment levels. And this data was then the input into much of our subsequent economic modelling, where it was not simply reported at face value. So, for example, productivity was estimated by combining the employment and the GVA figures to look at the relative per person contribution of physics compared to other sectors of the economy. That exercise initially provided estimates for what we refer to here in the bubble chart on the screen as the direct impacts of the sector. And this is the economic value generated specifically within those 72 codes that were on screen a moment ago. So that would be, for example, the turnover of the photographic activities businesses, or it might be the total employment in the physics-related manufacturing sectors. But there's two further levels of economic impact that we look at as part of this, which we refer to as indirect and induced impacts. So indirect impacts are predominantly associated with supply chains. When you have physics-related entities or physics sector businesses who are demanding other goods and services from their suppliers, that supports turnover for their suppliers, that supports jobs in those businesses, etc. And that is a further impact layer that, while not necessarily generated by the physics sectors, is certainly supported or facilitated. And that's one that we estimate as part of this study. A similar logic applies for the induced impacts. Here we are looking at the activity of the employees in either the physics-based sectors or their supply chains, the income they earn as a result of their employment, their wider spending in the economy, and the economic activity that supports or that induces. And that combination of the direct, the indirect, and the induced impacts refers to what we talk about as the aggregate impacts, and that is the slightly higher set of figures that were referred to as part of the prior stage of the presentation. Those indirect and those induced impacts, without getting too technical, are calculated through what we refer to as an input-output model, which is a model of the EU economy that sets out the interrelationship and the linkages between different sectors of the economy, different agents within the economy, and ultimately the extent to which activity in some areas, or in this instance in the physics-based sector, supports wider economic activity elsewhere in the economy, in other words, through those indirect and those induced impact layers. And that process, that input-output model, leads to the generation of economic multipliers, which set out the relationship between the direct impacts and the aggregate impacts. So when we talk about, for example, every job in the physics-based sector supporting approximately 1.8 further jobs elsewhere in the economy, that is referring to the indirect and the induced impacts, and subsequently the aggregate economic footprint of physics. That modelling takes place for gross value added, for total output, and for employment. We also look at a set of other metrics within the report, some of which were touched on a moment ago. Business demography is a big one that is part of that. Here we're looking at the business population in terms of the number of firms, in terms of the birth rate, the death rate, and that is sourced predominantly, again, as I mentioned, from the Eurostat structural business statistics. We also wanted to understand a little bit more how some of that economic activity manifests, and also how the physics-based sector interacts with either the rest of the economy, or the European physics-based sector interacts with the global economy. And so we extend the analysis to consider 3 further variables related to international trade, FDI flows, foreign direct investment, and also R&D expenditure. Those, again, were estimated primarily based upon data sourced from Eurostat. A couple of them were the SBS again, and we have a separate data set that helpfully provides some FDI data for FDI flows. But that was estimated in combination with wider data from the national accounts within the specific countries. And that again gives us the ability to then build up and enhance the sort of understanding we have of the physics-based sector, and the way that those economic impacts manifest, and ultimately the way they support the European economy. Thank you.